So does that mean that butter is back? Is butter a health food?
It's a trick question. So I don't avoid butter in any way, shape, or form. I think we're just talking about steak before this. So I don't avoid. I'm not afraid of fats. But I think there is. There was a group that got together, Thorning et al. They have this great paper in 2017, and they got together in Denmark. And the question was, dairy fat, is it good? Is it bad for us? Is it neutral, or is it good for us? Because the studies are kind of all over the place, right? And like you said, it starts cleaning up once you get to whole fat dairy. And so a lot of mess is because they don't necessarily differentiate between non-fat, medium and whole fat. But what they concluded is that there are specific ingredients within milk that can do better on their own when given in isolation versus when they're mixed with all these other fatty acids. And in general, it's better to get your nutrients from food. And I think kids and growing children, young adults, probably should get back to drinking milk, whole fat milk if you can, and butter and dairy. I do think it needs to come back. Think it needs to not be actively told to avoid our USDA, recommendations. I think you might have just been chatting about things like this.
Possibly at the Senate,
right?
Yeah.
The USDA recommendations has 164 pages in it. They mention saturated fats as something to avoid 161 times.
Wow.
And they don't talk about the odd chain fatty acids at all, despite the fact that there are over 100 papers that are repeatedly and consistently showing the same thing, that C15 is a positive and beneficial and now essential fatty acid. So it's like we need the conversation to get going. It's just we have these blinders up, of all saturated fats are bad. Milk and butter are bad for us, and we just need to revisit the data and the science and just have a conversation about it.
Well, why do you think saturated fat continues to be demonized? There was actually a paper that came out, a month ago, that looked at the top sources of added sugar and saturated fat in the American diet, and the top sources of saturated fat were all dairy fat.
Yeah. So
red meat, which most people will point a finger to as being a dietary villain, one of the major sources of saturated fat in the diet, in actuality only accounts for 3%.
I didn't know
of the saturated fat in the American diet. Yeah, unprocessed red meat, excluding mixed dishes. So like a mixed dish, you might think of like lasagna or a burrito or even pizza, something like that.
Right.
But unprocessed red meat. So we're talking like steak.
Right.
Outside of the context of a mixed dish, only accounts for 3% of the saturated fat in the standard American diet.
I just learned that.
And yet it is so often made to be the dietary villain.
Yeah. So our primary source is from dairy fat. And so again, I think we need to figure out how to get this balance. And so can we get to, so other things that have been happening in the dairy fat front is that industry changes. So we know that cows that are fed that eat grass create milk that has twice as much C15 in it than cows that are fed corn.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there are things like, and even there are studies showing that the altitude of the grass that they eat influences their C15. So the higher altitude the grass a ruminant eats, the higher their C15 levels, even among the grass eaters. So it means that and it's statistically significant. And so it means that when we are eating our whole fat foods, we don't necessarily know anymore how much C15 is in it. So it means that there's room, and it could help explain kind of the messiness of studies of really understanding how can we maximize the amount of C15 present in that dairy fat so that it could help override or be able to better compete against the other fats in there. There's still a pretty compelling science explanation or science evidence for even chain saturated fatty acids. They are pro-inflammatory in the lab. How does that translate? How much does that translate? In real life, I think we're still finding out. And we know that our bodies can make these even chain saturated fatty acids. So our higher levels of even chain impart not just from the food, but we have a disease state, and that disease state is resulting in increased production of these even chain fats. So I think the jury's still out.
Higher
Max.
carbohydrate diets increase production of saturated fat.
There you go. Yeah.
Like blood levels of saturated fat, which are clinically never measured. I don't think there's much utility for it, but they increase in response to carbohydrate feeding.
Yeah, I mean, so it's exactly telling you that. So it's like, okay, an unhealthy state and you have higher saturated fatty acid levels. So, and specifically, specifically these even chain. The reason why C15 didn't fall into that camp is because we don't readily make enough C15. So it didn't show up in that profile. So that's where it's still figuring out where the even chains play. Is it because we produce more of it in an unhealthy state? Or is it a combination of eating these even chain saturated fats too?
Interesting. Okay, so grass-fed dairy has higher levels.
Double.
Yeah. Wow. Does organic farming versus conventional farming, does that have an impact?
There was a study done in pregnant women in which it showed that pregnant women who preferred organic foods had higher C15 levels. That's the biggest study I've seen with regard to organic foods. There are some encouraging studies from Sardinia. Got to get the longevity blue zone conversation right in.
Blue zones are kind of a scam, but yes.
So
point taken. I mean, no, they're obviously healthy populations.
So healthy population. Yeah. So in Sardinia, and this is where men are most likely to live to 100 and beyond, more so than anywhere else in the world. And it looks like they're able to do so because they're less likely to die specifically of heart disease. So when you look at their C15 levels of people in Sardinia, again, the average person in the U.S. and most of the world is about 2.2%. In Sardinia, they're 0.6%. So they've got 3 times higher C15 levels. And so the question is, what are they doing? And what they've done is they have replaced meat with cheese. So they have meat maybe once a week on Sundays and special occasions. But the Sardinian population, that's this high longevity zone, is in a high altitude mountainous area. They have their local sheep and goats that graze on the mountainous grass. And they make a cheese, pecorino, which is remarkably high in C15. Pecorino.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't have any stock in pecorino, but I tell you, that's the cheese of choice. So that does mean that, so they're able to get to these, what we're calling kind of like longevity zone C15 levels through the diet, but it's they basically have all the right conditions to set them up for a successful use of C15 from the foods. There was a separate study that came from Harvard and a bunch of other collaborators. It was this large prospective cohort study, and they showed that people who followed over long periods of time, people who have C15 levels between 0.4 and 0.6 were the least likely to develop cardiovascular disease. So maybe there's something there of getting higher levels and being able to support, longevity and longer life.
Yeah. Do different mammals produce it in their milk at higher levels? Like, is goat milk richer in it? Do we know? There are studies that do compare them. Goats come out on top. You're seeing me pause. Goats came out on top, but I do think its C15 levels are more influenced by what they're fed. And goats are not like factory farmed.
Yeah, exactly. That you don't have a lot of corn-fed goats out there, so they tend to be used to help clean up and graze. So I think you could take a cow and feed it a goat's diet, and that goat's milk will probably be
comparable. Interesting.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.